The leather whip cracked through the morning air like thunder, and Alara Vance didn't scream. Blood trickled down her back as she stood tied to the wooden post in Copper Ridge's town square. But her brown eyes burned with defiance that made Mayor Titus Blackwood's jaw clench with rage. "This is what happens to women who forget their place," Blackwood announced to the growing crowd of townspeople. His voice carried across the dusty square like a preacher delivering judgment. "Ms. Vance has refused a perfectly good marriage proposal from Mr. Beauregard Croft 3 times. Alara's hands were bound above her head, her torn dress revealing the fresh welts across her shoulders. She could feel the stares of every person in town, some filled with pity, others with disgust, and a few with something that looked like approval. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing her beg. Maybe another reminder will help her remember her duties. Blackwood continued nodding to his deputy, who raised the whip again. The crowd murmured uneasily. Old Mrs. Gable covered her mouth in horror. Young Thomas Flynn looked like he might be sick. Even some of the men shifted uncomfortably, though none dared speak against the mayor who controlled their livelihoods. Beauregard Croft stood off to the side, his thick arms crossed over his barreled chest, watching the punishment with cold satisfaction. At 45, he owned the largest cattle operation outside of town and had enough money to buy whatever he wanted, including apparently a wife, through public humiliation. "You could end this right now, girl," Croft called out, his voice rough as gravel. "Just say yes, and we'll get you cleaned up proper. I'll even throw in a new dress for the wedding." Alara's response was to spit in the dirt at his feet. The crowd gasped. Even Mayor Blackwood looked shocked at her boldness. No woman had ever defied them this publicly, this completely. In Copper Ridge, women married who they were told to marry, especially when substantial business arrangements hung in the balance. Stubborn as a mule, Blackwood muttered, his face reddening. "Give her 5 more lashes, maybe that'll cure her of this foolish independence." The deputy raised his arm again, and that's when they heard it, the steady clip-clop of horse hooves approaching from the main road. Every head in the square turned to see a lone rider emerging from the morning mist, sitting tall in his saddle like he owned the entire territory. Gideon Hawk had arrived in Copper Ridge, but what he was about to do would turn this quiet Montana town upside down forever. Gideon Hawk didn't say a word as he dismounted his black stallion in one fluid motion. His boots hit the ground with purpose, spurs jingling softly as he walked toward the crowd. At 6'2", with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, he commanded attention without trying. The townspeople parted like water as he approached, their whispered conversations dying in their throats. Everyone in Montana Territory knew the name Hawk, war hero, successful rancher, and a man who'd killed 17 Confederate soldiers with nothing but a cavalry saber and pure determination. Mayor Blackwood straightened his vest, trying to project authority he suddenly wasn't sure he possessed. "Mr. Hawk, this is city business, nothing that concerns you." Gideon stopped 10 feet from the whipping post, his steel-gray eyes taking in every detail. Alara's bloodied back, the fear in the crowd's faces, the smug satisfaction on Croft's features. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Cut her down," he said quietly. The words carried across the square like a death sentence. Mayor Blackwood's face went pale, then flushed deep red. "Now see here, Hawk. This woman has defied a lawful marriage arrangement. Mr. Croft has paid good money for paid money." Gideon's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You're selling women now, Blackwood?" "It's a legal contract," Croft interjected, stepping forward with his chest puffed out. "The girl owes my family a debt. Her father borrowed against my cattle last winter and died before he could repay. She works it off through marriage, or she works it off through other means." Gideon turned his full attention to Croft, and the bigger man actually took a step back. "Other means? Indentures 7 years of service to pay the debt." Croft's voice had lost some of its bluster. "Marriage is the charitable option. Alara found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. My father never borrowed anything from you, you lying snake. Girl's got spirit, Croft laughed, but the sound was forced. That's why I want her. Break that spirit properly, and she'll make a fine wife. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something momentous was happening in their little town square. Mrs. Gable was praying softly under her breath. Gideon walked closer to the whipping post, close enough that Alara could see the small scar across his left cheek. Close enough to notice how his hands remained perfectly steady, despite the tension crackling through the air. What's your name? He asked her gently. Alara Vance, she managed. Surprised by the kindness in his voice. Miss Vance, did your father owe this man money? No, sir. Papa died of fever, never borrowed a cent in his life. Gideon nodded once, then turned back to face Mayor Blackwood and Croft. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded soldiers in battle. Cut her down now. You got no authority here, Hawk Blackwood blustered. This is my town, my jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction ends where my conscience begins. Gideon's hand moved to rest on the grip of his Colt .45. And my conscience says this stops now. The deputy holding the whip looked nervously between his boss and the dangerous stranger who'd just threatened to draw on them. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. But Croft wasn't backing down. His own hand dropped to his weapon, and his 3 hired men shifted closer, surrounding Gideon like wolves preparing to attack. You're outnumbered, stranger, Croft growled. Walk away while you still can. Gideon smiled, then a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. I've been outnumbered before. The clock tower began to chime 8 o'clock, and in that moment, everyone in Copper Ridge realized they were about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. The first gunshot shattered the morning silence before anyone could blink. Gideon's Colt appeared in his hand, like magic smoke curling from the barrel, as Croft's fastest hired gun crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder and screaming. Jesus Christ, someone in the crowd shouted. And people scattered like startled chickens, mothers grabbing children and running for cover behind wagons and storefronts. But Gideon wasn't done. His second shot took out another of Croft's men before the fool could clear leather, the bullet shattering his wrist and sending his pistol spinning into the dirt. The third man threw his hands up in surrender, his face white as fresh snow. Anyone else want to dance? Gideon asked conversationally, his gun trained on Croft's chest. Mayor Blackwood was pressed back against the general store wall. His fancy suit rumpled and his face slick with sweat. You can't just shoot people in my town. There are laws. Your laws seem mighty selective, Blackwood. Gideon kept his eyes on Croft, who stood frozen with his own weapon half drawn. Draw it or drop it, but make up your mind quick. Croft's hand was shaking as he slowly pulled his fingers away from his gun and raised them above his head. For all his bluster about buying women and breaking spirits, he wasn't brave enough to face down a man who just demonstrated the kind of shooting skills that legends were made of. Smart choice, Gideon said. He moved to the whipping post where Alara still hung by her wrists, her brown eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. Hold still. One quick slice of his knife cut through the ropes binding her hands. Alara collapsed to her knees, her legs too weak to support her after the ordeal. Gideon caught her before she could hit the ground, his strong arm steadying her with surprising gentleness. Easy there, miss. You're safe now. My back, she whispered, pain making her voice tight. I know we'll get you cleaned up. He looked around at the scattered crowd, many of whom were peeking out from their hiding places, like prairie dogs checking for hawks. Someone get Doc Henshaw now. No one moved. They were all too afraid of getting caught in the crossfire if the shooting started up again. I said now. Gideon's voice cracked like a whip, and young Thomas Flynn took off running toward the doctor's office like his pants were on fire. Croft found his voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. You just made yourself a powerful enemy, stranger. I got friends in the territorial government. They'll hunt you down like a dog. Gideon helped Alara to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed unsteadily. Then I guess I better make sure they have good reason to remember my name. He looked directly at Mayor Blackwood, and his next words carried across the square like a judge pronouncing sentence. This woman is under my protection now. Anyone who touches her answers to me. But as Doc Henshaw came running with his medical bag, none of them noticed the rider who'd been watching from the hilltop above town, or how he wheeled his horse around and galloped hard toward the county seat. The real trouble was just beginning. Doc Henshaw's hands shook as he cleaned the wounds on Alara's back. His medical office silent, except for her sharp intakes of breath and the distant sound of hammering as shopkeepers boarded up their windows. Word of the shooting had spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire, and everyone was preparing for what they were sure would be a war. These cuts aren't too deep, thank God, Doc Henshaw muttered, applying salve to the worst of the welts. But she'll carry these scars for life. Gideon stood by the window, watching the street with the alertness of a man who'd survived too many ambushes to let his guard down now. His Colt was reloaded and holstered, but his hand never strayed far from the grip. How long before she can travel? He asked without turning around. Travel? Alara spoke up from the examination table, wincing as the doctor wrapped clean bandages around her torso. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, not anymore. It isn't. Gideon finally turned to face her, and she could see the grim certainty in his gray eyes. Croft wasn't bluffing about his government connections. Come nightfall, this place will be crawling with federal marshals, all carrying warrants with my name on them. Doc Henshaw paused in his bandaging. What about warrants for Croft for what he was doing to this girl? Gideon's laugh was bitter. Men like Croft don't get warrants, they issue them. Alara tried to sit up straighter, her jaw set with the same defiance she had shown at the whipping post. I won't run. I won't let them drive me from the only home I've ever known. Then you'll die here, Gideon said bluntly. Is that what you want? Because that's what's going to happen if you stay. Before she could answer, the door burst open and young Thomas Flynn tumbled inside, his face flushed from running. Mr. Hawk. Mr. Hawk, there's riders coming up the south road, lots of them. Through the window, they could see the dust cloud rising in the distance, at least a dozen horses moving fast toward town. Gideon cursed under his breath and checked his pocket watch faster than I expected. He looked at Alara, who was struggling to put her torn dress back on over the bandages. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they get here. Decision time, Miss Vance. She stared at him, this stranger who'd risked everything to save her from a fate worse than death. If you were Alara, what would you do? Stay and fight for your home, knowing you'd probably die or run with a man you barely knew into an uncertain future. Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Alara decided next would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone in Copper Ridge. Why, she asked quietly. Why did you help me? You don't even know me. Gideon was already moving, gathering supplies from Doc Henshaw's cabinet. Sometimes a man sees something that reminds him why he's still breathing. Sometimes that's enough. Doc Henshaw was wrapping extra bandages and medicine in a cloth bundle. There's a back trail through Miller's Canyon. If you ride hard, you can reach the territorial line by sunset. And then what Alara demanded. Where am I supposed to go? I have no money, no family. No, you'll have me, Gideon said simply. The words hung in the air between them like a promise. And Alara felt something shift in her chest. Not just gratitude, but something deeper and more dangerous. Trust, maybe, or hope. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was getting louder. Decide now, Gideon said, his hand extended toward her. Live free or die here, but decide. Alara looked at his outstretched hand, then at Doc Henshaw's worried face. Then out the window, where she could see the first of the riders cresting the hill. She took his hand. They slipped out the back door of Doc Henshaw's office just as the federal marshals thundered into the main street, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Gideon had his black stallion waiting in the alley, along with a smaller mare that Doc Henshaw kept for emergency calls. "Can you ride?" Gideon asked, helping Alara into the saddle despite the pain in her back. "Born on horseback," she replied through gritted teeth, though her face was pale from the effort. They could hear shouting from the front of the building, Marshal Corbett's voice demanding to know where the murderous gunslinger had gone. Doc Henshaw was playing innocent, claiming he'd been tending to wounds and hadn't seen anyone matching Gideon's description. Gideon mounted his stallion and motioned for Alara to follow him toward the narrow trail that wound behind the livery stable. They moved quietly, using the buildings as cover. But just as they reached the edge of town, a shout rang out behind them. There behind Sweeney's barn ride, Gideon commanded, spurring his horse into a gallop. Alara dug her heels into the mare's flanks and followed her back, screaming in protest with every jarring step. Behind them she could hear the thunder of pursuing hooves and the angry shouts of the marshals who'd been made to look like fools. They raced across the open ground toward Miller's Canyon, the horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air like smoke signals announcing their escape route. Gunshots cracked behind them, bullets whistling overhead. But Gideon seemed to know exactly where he was going. "There's a narrow pass up ahead," he called over the sound of their horses' labored breathing. "They'll have to follow single file." The canyon walls rose up around them like protective arms. Red stone streaked with veins of quartz that caught the sunlight and threw it back in blinding flashes. The trail was barely wide enough for one horse, forcing their pursuers to string out in a long line that robbed them of their numerical advantage. Alara risked a glance back and saw Marshal Corbett at the head of the pursuit, his face dark with rage. Behind him rode 6 more lawmen, all armed and determined to bring in the man who'd made them look incompetent in front of an entire town. How far to the territorial line? She gasped. 5 miles through the canyon, then another 10 across open country. Gideon's voice was steady despite their desperate situation. "Question is whether these horses can make it." Already she could feel her mare beginning to falter, the animal's sides heaving with exhaustion. Gideon's stallion was stronger, but even he was showing signs of strain after the hard run from town. "There's something you need to know." Alara called out, her voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves on stone. What Croft wasn't lying about everything. "My father did owe money, just not to him." Gideon shot her a sharp look. Who did he owe? The man leading that posse, Marshal Corbett. If you're loving this wild ride through the Old West, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to get even more intense. The revelation hit Gideon like a physical blow, and suddenly everything made terrible sense. This wasn't about justice or law enforcement. This was about collecting a debt, and Alara was the collateral. How much? Gideon asked as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of the trail, their horses picking their way carefully between loose stones that could send them tumbling into the canyon below. $500. Alara replied, shame coloring her voice. "Papa borrowed it last winter when the fever took half our cattle. He was going to pay it back after the spring roundup, but he died first." Gideon finished grimly, and Corbett saw an opportunity to collect more than just money. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Marshal Corbett had been working with Croft from the beginning, using his federal authority to legitimize what was essentially human trafficking. How many other women had they trapped in similar schemes across the territory? Behind them, the sound of pursuit was getting closer. The narrow canyon that had initially worked in their favor was now becoming a trap. There was nowhere to go but forward, and Corbett knew these trails just as well as Gideon did. "We need to get out of this canyon," Gideon muttered, scanning the rocky walls for any sign of an escape route. There, Alara pointed to a steep path that branched off to the left, barely visible among the shadows. Papa used to take me hunting up there when I was little. It leads to the mesa top. Gideon studied the treacherous-looking trail with a practiced eye. It was steep enough to break a horse's leg, narrow enough that one wrong step would send them plummeting to their deaths. But it was also their only chance. "That's not a trail, it's suicide," he said. "It's better than what Corbett has planned for us." A bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall just inches from Gideon's head, showering them both with stone chips. Corbett and his men had closed to within rifle range, and their aim was improving with every shot. "Your choice," Alara said, already turning her mare toward the deadly path. "Follow me or face Corbett, but decide fast." She was right, and they both knew it. Gideon cursed under his breath and followed her up the treacherous slope, his stallion's hooves scrabbling for purchase on the loose shale. Below them, Corbett's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You're trapped, Hawk. Surrender the woman, and I might let you live." Gideon's response was to put another bullet between Corbett's eyes, or would have if the marshal hadn't ducked behind a boulder at the last second. The message was clear enough: no surrender, no mercy, no quarter given or asked. The climb was a nightmare of loose rock and narrow ledges, their horses snorting with fear as they picked their way higher and higher above the canyon floor. Alara's mare stumbled once, sending a shower of stones clattering down into the abyss, but somehow kept her footing. "Don't look down," Gideon called out, though he couldn't tell if he was talking to Alara or himself. They were halfway to the top when they heard the sound that chilled their blood. Corbett and his men had started up the trail behind them. The marshal was nothing if not persistent, and he clearly wanted Alara badly enough to risk his own neck on the deadly path. "Can't much more," Alara gasped, her face gray with pain and exhaustion. The wounds on her back had reopened during their desperate flight, and her shirt was soaked with blood. Almost there, Gideon encouraged, though he could see she was reaching the end of her strength. Just a little further, they crested the rim of the mesa, just as the sun began to set, painting the vast expanse of prairie before them in shades of gold and crimson. But there was no time to appreciate the beauty. Corbett's men were still climbing, and the mesa top offered no cover from their rifles. "Now what?" Alara asked, swaying in her saddle. Gideon looked across the open ground toward the distant line of trees that marked the territorial border. It was at least 8 miles, and their horses were already exhausted. Behind them, Corbett appeared at the rim of the canyon like a vengeful demon, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. But then Gideon saw something that made him smile for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Smoke rising from a cluster of buildings about 2 miles to the north, the Paiute trading post that most white folks pretended didn't exist. But Gideon had traded there before. And more importantly, he'd fought alongside their war chief during a particularly nasty skirmish with cattle rustlers the previous summer. "Can you make it 2 more miles?" he asked Alara. She straightened in her saddle despite the pain etched across her features. "Lead the way." They rode hard across the mesa top, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth as Corbett's voice roared behind them. "I'll follow you to hell itself, Hawk. That woman belongs to me." The trading post appeared ahead of them, like a mirage. A collection of sturdy wooden buildings surrounded by a split-rail fence with smoke rising from several chimneys and the warm glow of lamplights spilling from the windows. As they approached, Gideon could see armed men emerging from the buildings, alerted by the sound of approaching riders. "Who comes?" called out a voice in accented English. Gideon Hawk seeking sanctuary for the woman, he replied using the formal words that would invoke the ancient laws of hospitality. A tall man stepped into the light, his long black hair streaked with silver and his weathered face marked by old scars. Jacob Stonebear, war chief of the local Paiute band, and a man who owed Gideon his life. "My brother returns," Jacob said with a slight smile. But not alone and not in peace. Federal marshals may be 10 minutes behind us. They want the woman for a debt that isn't hers to pay. Jacob's expression darkened. He'd seen enough of white man's justice to know how it usually worked for people who couldn't afford to buy their way out of trouble. Bring her inside, we will speak of this. They dismounted quickly, Gideon helping Alara down from her exhausted mare. Her legs nearly buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright as Jacob led them toward the main building. Your woman is hurt, Jacob observed, noting the blood on Alara's shirt. She's not my woman, Gideon started to say, then stopped. Looking at Alara's pale but determined face, he realized that somewhere during their desperate flight, something fundamental had changed between them. She's under my protection. Same thing, Jacob replied with the ghost of a smile. They'd barely gotten inside when the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Corbett's arrival. Through the window, they could see the marshal and his men spreading out around the trading post, their rifles gleaming in the lamplight. You're harboring fugitives, Corbett shouted. Federal law requires you to surrender them immediately. Jacob stepped outside, flanked by a dozen of his warriors, all armed and ready for trouble. This is sovereign territory, Marshal. Your laws end at our fence line. Corbett's face flushed with rage. Don't quote Indian treaties to me, Chief. I've got warrants signed by the territorial governor himself. Show me these warrants. There was a long pause, and Gideon knew exactly why. Corbett had been so eager to pursue them that he'd never bothered to get proper paperwork. This had been personal from the start. I don't need to show you anything, Corbett snarled. You've got 1 hour to surrender them, or we're coming in after them. But Jacob Stonebear had faced down the U.S. Army before, and he wasn't impressed by one corrupt marshal and his hired guns. The standoff lasted until dawn, with Corbett's men surrounding the trading post, while Jacob's warriors maintained a silent vigil from behind the fence. Neither side was willing to fire the first shot that would turn a tense situation into a massacre. Inside the main building, Alara had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping fitfully on a pile of buffalo robes, while Jacob's wife tended to her wounds with traditional healing herbs. Gideon kept watch by the window, his rifle ready, but his mind working on a different kind of solution. There's something you should know about your Marshal, Corbett, Jacob said quietly, settling down beside him with 2 cups of strong coffee. I'm listening. 3 winters ago, he came here demanding tribute, said we needed to pay for the privilege of trading with white settlers. When we refused, he burned our winter stores and left us to starve. Gideon turned to study his friend's weathered face. How did you survive? We didn't, all of us. Lost 6 elders and 4 children before spring came. Jacob's voice was carefully controlled, but Gideon could see the old pain in his dark eyes. Been waiting for the right chance to balance the scales. As if summoned by their conversation, Corbett's voice boomed across the compound. Time's up, Chief. Send them out or we're coming in. Jacob stood slowly checking his rifle. Seems like that chance just arrived, but Gideon was already moving toward the door. No, this is my fight, not yours. You've already done enough, Brother Jacob said softly. Some fights belong to all of us. Outside, Corbett was losing his patience. His men looked tired and edgy after the long night, and some were starting to mutter about the wisdom of attacking a fortified position held by experienced warriors. Last warning, Corbett shouted. I'm counting to 10, then we're coming over that fence. Gideon stepped out of the building, his hands empty but his Colt within easy reach. No need for that, Corbett, I'm here. The marshal's face lit up with savage satisfaction. Smart man now. Where's the woman gone? Gideon lied smoothly. Sent her on ahead while you were making all that noise. She's probably halfway to California by now. Corbett's expression darkened. You're lying, am I? You want to search every building in this place? Jacob's people might have something to say about that. For the first time, Corbett seemed to notice the armed warriors positioned around the compound, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. He was a bully and a coward, but he wasn't completely stupid. "The debt still stands," Corbett said, through gritted teeth, 500 plus interest. Gideon reached into his vest and pulled out a leather pouch, tossing it at Corbett's feet. It landed with the solid thunk of gold coins. "There's your money debt paid in full." Corbett stared at the pouch, then at Gideon. "This doesn't change anything between us, Hawk." "No." Gideon agreed quietly. "It doesn't." The marshal and his men rode away as the sun crested the eastern mountains, their threats and bluster fading with the morning mist. But Gideon knew they'd be back, probably with more men and better legal justification. Inside the trading post, Alara was awake and sitting up, her brown eyes bright with questions. "Did you really pay my father's debt?" "Seemed like the right thing to do. $500 is a lot of money." Gideon shrugged. "I've got more land than I know what to do with, and no one to share it with. Money's just paper until you find something worth spending it on." She studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that made her heart beat faster. "What happens now?" "Now we head to my ranch. It's a long way from here, far enough that Corbett won't follow. You can stay as long as you like, or until you decide what you want to do with your life." "And if I decide I want to stay permanently?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that neither of them had dared to voice during their desperate flight. Gideon looked at this brave, stubborn woman who'd risked everything rather than submit to a forced marriage, and knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. "Then, I guess I'd have to build another room onto the house," he said, with a small smile. 3 months later, Gideon Hawk and Alara Vance were married in a simple ceremony at the trading post, with Jacob Stonebear officiating and half the territory in attendance. They built that extra room and eventually filled it with the laughter of children who grew up hearing the story of how their mother refused to be broken, and how their father rode into town just in time to set her free. Now click on the video on the screen, because the next story carries something you can't explain, only feel. And when it ends, you won't be the same. Click on the video now.